Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. The world is experiencing a dam building boom. According to research by my guest today, David Hulme, there are plans underway around the world for the construction of over 3,700 new dams. And this explosion in dam building comes after a period in which there was a lull in the construction of new dam projects. So what accounts for this new interest in dams? Where are these new dams being built? And do dams contribute to sustainable development or do they detract from it? We discuss these questions and more in the episode you are about to hear. David Hulme is an academic who leads the FutureDAMS consortium at the University of Manchester's Global Development Institute, and in this capacity, he helps policymakers make better informed decisions about dam projects, and we discuss at length what academic research can tell us about what makes dam projects succeed or fail in their stated goals. This episode is part of a new content partnership between the podcast and the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. For the next several months, we will be featuring from time to time experts from the Global Development Institute who will discuss their research and also the pressing news of the day as it relates to global inequalities and development. If you'd like to learn more about the Global Development Institute, you can go to gdi.manchester.ac.uk or click on the ad on globaldispatchespodcast.com. I'm excited that this is the discussion on which we will kick off the partnership. So here is my conversation with academic David Hulme.
The main reason that people build dams is because water and using water really helps with meeting our basic needs. We need water to drink, to keep hydrated. We need water because we've moved into agriculture and we need it for our crops. And then increasingly, we've found that we can use water for hydroelectric power, that we can produce relatively cheap electricity by trapping water and running it through turbines. So water is fundamental to life, but then it also allows a whole set of other things to happen, such as generating electricity, such as producing surpluses of food. And historically, that has been what has then allowed for development, as it's often called. It's allowed us to urbanize. It's allowed us to become specialized, to increase our incomes, and to have specialized education and health services. So it underpins all of the things which are associated with a better quality of life.
So dams are sort of central to human evolution in a way.
Well, certainly if you're looking sort of at social organization, then, some academics will argue dams are absolutely, and water management is absolutely fundamental to understanding how sophisticated societies evolved. And they point to Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Tigris and other river basins, and point out that where you first begin to get urbanization and sophistication, arts developing, and social organization, then often that's associated with dams and water management, because in a way, to be able to build and operate dams and manage water, you need to have thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people coordinating their activities. So you have to have a sophisticated organization. And those sorts of arguments would then argue that ultimately, when you're thinking about sort of states and about nation states nowadays, that actually the idea of how you form a nation comes from trying to manage water. And quite often that was associated with trying to dam it and then send it down canals.
So your research shows that we are currently in a dam building boom. Before we discuss the implications of our current sort of dam building boom, can you talk a little bit about previous eras in sort of more modern times where the decisions to build dams have ebbed and flowed, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, our research is particularly focusing upon the present boom of dam building in Africa and Asia and Latin America. And if you look at those parts of the world, quite often they used to be called the developing countries and sometimes still are. Then there's really been three phases to dam building and major investments in water management. When the countries of Africa and Asia in particular became independent in the 1950s and 1960s, there were 25, 30 years of dam building around the world. And certainly the richer countries in the world, the USA, Canada, the UK, and European countries and Japan, were very keen to sometimes lend money, sometimes provide grants, and encourage their engineering companies to build dams in the developing parts of the world. Around about the 1980s, things began to slow down a bit, and we began to actually move into a sort of 20-year moratorium almost. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that many of the dams that were built in this sort of first phase of dam building were not delivering their promises. They cost a lot more to build, quite a lot of them, and often they didn't provide the amounts of electricity that had been predicted. They didn't provide the amounts of irrigation. They didn't necessarily generate the number of jobs that had been claimed from them. So there were questions about whether they were actually delivering as investments.
Is the Aswan Dam a good example of that dynamic? This was the big development project by Egypt's first, nationalist leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, which didn't seem to be delivering on the promises that he had when he had it built in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, Aswan Dam, I suppose it's fundamental to the Egyptian economy now, but it didn't manage to deliver, I think, the amounts of irrigation water and electricity that had been promised. The costs did overrun. And when you look at that dam nowadays, then actually people looking at the Nile Basin, whether it's sensible to have a big reservoir, which is basically water storage, in one of the hottest parts of the world where you have very high rates of evaporation, then it's not the sort of place nowadays, if you're looking technically at it, maybe where you'd want to have a dam on the Nile. So yeah, the Aswan Dam would illustrate that, but probably even more so, there are a whole series of irrigation dams built in Africa, quite a lot of them in Nigeria, and other parts of West Africa, and they never irrigated anything like the areas of land that was promised, and often they disrupted pre-existing agricultural systems and destroyed quite large fishery industries. So certainly with those sort of irrigation dams in West Africa, there were very big questions about whether they'd actually sort of done more damage than they'd actually led to benefits.
And so all of that led to a moratorium that sort of lasted for most of the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, it led to a moratorium, but that moratorium was also partly one began to get the environmental movement really gathering momentum in the late 70s and throughout the 80s. And the environmental movement pointed out that many of these dams were certainly bad if you were thinking about biodiversity, thinking about the conservation of areas that had been set aside for conservation purposes. So there was a very strong environmental voice too about this. And also there were concerns about indigenous people and particularly about pastoralists, that many of these dams seemed to displace people, and the people they displaced were not well treated. They were promised compensation, but they didn't get that compensation. They were promised they'd get new land, but then 10 years later, when you look, they haven't got it. So in a way, there was the question about, are these wise investments? The questions about, are these just damaging the environment too much? And then questions about, are these damaging the people who are displaced by these dams too much?
So dams fell out of fashion, but now they're hot again. So what changed?
Well, they fell out of fashion, essentially because the World Bank began to increasingly look at the social and environmental impacts, what's called the safeguarding agenda, and it became incredibly expensive and long-winded to try and go through those World Bank safeguarding procedures. And essentially, the World Bank, which had previously been involved in many of the major Western dams, stopped lending. The Soviet Union, which had in the 1950s and 60s been very keen to build dams, as with the Aswan Dam in Egypt, the Soviet Union could clearly no longer afford to build dams. So one had this period from the late 80s moving through into the early 2000s when relatively few dams are built. But then in the early 2000s, China is being increasingly reported to be an emerging power, and the Chinese economy has been growing massively, and the Chinese government begins to think about its relationships, certainly with Asian countries, and then moving on to African, Latin American countries. And one of the things which they hook onto is we could invest in infrastructure, because the World Bank and the sort of Western controlled financial institutions are not funding infrastructure. And quite often that means looking at dams and sort of major water management systems. So from the early 2000s, the Chinese begin to increasingly finance dams. And certainly quite a lot of the recent dam building has been financed by a variety of Chinese agencies. The Indian government has got involved in this. Brazilian, the government and private companies have got involved, and there's been private money coming in. But initially it was the Chinese who really began to invest in dams and water management.
And what are some examples of their investments that perhaps demonstrate both the positive and negative outcomes of Chinese investments in dams? What are some specific dams you could talk about that are illustrative?
Well, I think the particular dams that one might look at would probably be some that have been built in Myanmar and that's on the Irrawaddy and the Salween, and then looking over to the Mekong Delta in Laos, and that. On the positive side, these things may have added, they certainly add to initial economic growth rates, because the construction industry feeds in short term into economic growth rates, which many politicians and businesses like. They've increased the availability of hydroelectric power supplies. But then when you look on the downside, there are the problems of environmental damaging the environment. Some of that is a concern about the environment in its own right and the loss of species, in a way the challenges to some of the dolphin species in Southeast Asia when you begin to block the Mekong, and the way you begin to disrupt the areas where they live, but also in terms of the fisheries, and whether one finds that people who've made their living out of fisheries for a long time beginning to report that the fish have moved on, the fish are no longer available, the water levels have changed, and that in a way that important species of fish for livelihood purposes have been disrupted. And one also has, significant reports about the people who are being resettled, not being given the land that they've been promised, not being compensated in the way that they've been promised. And certainly this safeguarding, this idea of making sure there's a really serious environmental study about what the consequences are going to be, making sure there is a study of the social impacts. Then many of these Chinese programs in Southeast Asia have been accused of not focusing enough on these safeguarding issues.
So on balance, then, it seems that the Chinese investment in dam building, which has led to an explosion in dam building today, has yielded sort of more negative outcomes in terms of, individual social welfare, and in terms of, say, like the sustainable development goals. On the one hand, you're providing a renewable energy source. On the other hand, you are causing all sorts of social displacement and environmental havoc.
Would have to say, the jury's out on that. There have certainly been negative costs in environmental and social terms in terms of the people that are displaced. The thing that's much harder to get a handle on, and our research is trying to get a handle on this, is trying to measure the benefits, particularly for the broader population. And if you build a dam, it may displace 5,000 people. You can actually, in a way, track the livelihoods of those people. That's often done by governments or by civil society groups. So you can record, in a way, the ways in which the lives of those people are damaged by the dam. But then the electricity that's being generated may be providing electricity for schools and health services for 1 million people. It may be potentially underpinning perhaps, 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 jobs in a nearby city. And it could be in a way that the benefits outweigh those costs that have been imposed on people, but it's very hard to actually track and measure those in a way what have sometimes been called intangible benefits. There are these improvements that are being spread across a large population, but it's very hard to work out what size those are and exactly how many people they're getting. So, one can't write off these Chinese dams at the moment, but one certainly needs to be looking closely at them, as one did at the first generation of dams, to work out, in a way, were they worthwhile, and to work out how might we do it better next time. And certainly, if you look for the research we're doing, we're not looking to make perfect dams, but we're certainly looking to make better dams to make sure that the problems that can be anticipated, particularly the environmental and social problems, that those are actually mitigated and managed in ways that mean that people aren't ultimately disadvantaged, and that the degree of environmental damage is understood and is judged to be acceptable by the domestic political systems of the countries that are proceeding with them. If we had a big worry, it is the danger that this second phase of dam building will actually repeat all of the mistakes that were made in the first phase, and that we won't actually have learned how not to make those mistakes. And in a way, that's really foolish to do that. It's hard to work out what a perfect dam is, but one should be able to look at what the mistakes that were made in the past and make sure those mistakes don't happen in the future. And it's not at all clear that we have done that, I think.
Well, so let me ask, what does your research suggest are elements of a good dam? What makes a dam a good? What makes sort of the positive side of the ledger of a dam building project outweigh the negative? What does your research suggest?
Okay, well, anyway, being academics, we make it very complicated, but I can simplify it to a degree. At the heart of our work is a modeling exercise, an exercise that allows the simulation of what the impacts of dams will be. And that's not just an economic simulation. In the model that we've got, you can look at 10 different criteria and look what the impacts will be. So you could look at how much electricity will be produced, how many jobs that might generate. You could look at the environmental damage. You could look at how many people would be displaced. You could look at what the impacts will be on fisheries, what the irrigation impacts would be, positive and negative. You could look at 10 different things. And it's possible then to do a whole series of simulations looking at those different objectives, hopefully getting those objectives identified, by the domestic political processes saying, in a way, these are the things that we would want to achieve. These are the things that would be unacceptable. And we can actually run up to potentially millions of simulations and then group those in clusters so that we can help decision makers understand, if you try to maximize the hydroelectric power, then maybe you'll get these major environmental problems. If you just back off a bit on the amount of electricity you're looking for, then the environmental problems could be dramatically reduced. If you're looking particularly for irrigation, then, if you went for this particular design, then we could actually provide everybody who's being displaced with at least the land they've got now. If you go for a different design, then that might not be possible. So you can begin to actually look in very sophisticated terms. So we're looking at whether it's possible to in a way, rather than having simple cost benefit analysis that try and turn everything into this is the dollar cost, this is the dollar that will actually be benefited. You actually have a dashboard, and you could look at, so what are the economic benefits? What are the environmental benefits or disbenefits? What's happening happening to to the local population? What are the impacts on employment in this region? So
have governments used this model that you've developed? Have you worked sort of directly with governments so far on this?
Well, certainly. We're working in Ghana at the moment. In October, we'll be running this with a whole set of Ghanaian institutions, taking our model and getting our Ghanaian colleagues to help us work out how it could be applied in Ghana, how it could match the specific hydrological and geographical features they've got, and helping them to identify what the 10 criteria that they would want to use and looking at its feasibility. These models are being used in the UK. Certainly when you look at the water industry in the UK, about whether to invest in dams, whether to invest in pipelines and what to do, then these models are already being used in the rich world. That's to do with much broader water management, but also with some of the major dam systems. We're finding particular interest in groups like the World Bank, which are now getting interested in dams again, with the International Water Management Institute. We're finding there's a lot of demand in a way for these tools, but also with developing the capacity so that these tools could be used by scientists who work for national governments and by sort of NGOs and scientists working for non-profit organizations. So in a way, these tools are being used in a way in the rich world, in the OECD, in the USA, but now, particularly with the computer costs dropping so much, with, in a way, having supercomputing capacities without actually needing to build a supercomputer, we can really take these now into looking much more at lower income countries, but not just having foreign experts do this, actually creating the capacities and that. And our project is looking at producing these, when we produce these tools and that, they'll be open access. And we'll be looking at having capacity development support so we can help people adapt them for their country.
It's interesting to me that you just mentioned that the World Bank is wanting to get back into dam building. And I mean, that seems to be a consequence of the belief that through tools like yours, they can build better dams now than they could, back in the 60s and in the earlier period that you identified. Are there other countries' governments that are also looking to sort of get back in the dam game?
Yeah, well, certainly. Well, actually, I mean, in the US at the moment is developing, I think, in Congress, what's called the Build Bill. And it's about the US contributing much more to infrastructure in developing countries, looking at setting up a US International Development Finance Corporation that would put, in a way, US aid money into leveraging US private sector money to build infrastructure of all forms, of which dams and major water management systems would be one of them.
A sort of attempt, perhaps, to balance against China's Belt and Road initiative.
It definitely seems to be balancing that out. And when one looks at it in a way, I mean, one can criticize the Belt and Road and criticize the Chinese, but in a way, should African Asian countries be denied access to finance for infrastructure? Well, people will say no. I mean, if you want development, then we know from what's happened in Europe and the USA, you have to look at investing in some forms of infrastructure, but ideally you choose it well. And so actually, if there's a choice between a variety of Chinese finance and World Bank finance and maybe other forms of finance from Western banking and financial systems, then it would be possible certainly for countries to think about which packages of finance will meet their needs. And it in a way means this potential domination of infrastructure investment, which the West has criticized China for. Well, in a way, criticizing the Chinese but not putting your hand in your own pocket and finding an alternative is really a hypocritical thing to do. If we don't want the Chinese government and Chinese institutions to dominate infrastructure investment, then certainly the Western countries that are complaining need to find a way of financing infrastructure in the developing world.
So we are speaking just a few weeks after one of those dams in Laos burst, which seems to happen not infrequently. And I actually ran a piece on my own website, UN Dispatch, about how that dam burst unleashed unexploded ordnance all over the countryside that had been dropped there in the Vietnam War. It's a terrible problem in Laos, but this is just yet another example of the media, perhaps, and perhaps I'm guilty here, of portraying directly or indirectly dams as being a negative. What's behind that perception?
Well, I mean, I think obviously, I mean, on the sort of headline you're talking about, some very bad dams have been built, and that one that burst in Laos recently and washed people away and destroyed hundreds, if not thousands, of livelihoods is an example of how you can get a bad dam. That dam cost a lot of money to build, and it's actually produced totally negative results. So in a way, dams like that clearly, should not be built, should never have been thought about it. In a way, the problem when one looks at the media, though, is that, that's like 95% of it is basically saying stop dams, build no dams. But people need access to regular water supplies. People need access to electricity. I mean, you and I have it. Why shouldn't Africans and poor Asians eventually be getting access to it? And when you begin to think about that, then, you need to be thinking about how do we build better dams? How do we build dams that will actually give large numbers of people access to cheap electricity, hopefully that's reasonably sustainable? How do we build dams that will ensure that cities like Cape Town don't run out of water and have to think about closing down their water delivery system? How do we create dams that will generate jobs, that will allow people to go to medical facilities that have got electricity? And when you begin to think about that, then you realize that no, the message in the media shouldn't be build no dams. It should be build the right dams and build better dams. I mean, I'm talking to you from Manchester, which gives me and another 2 or 3 million other people a very good standard of living. Well, in a way, Manchester is dependent on a number of dams, not for hydroelectricity power, but for water supply. And these dams were built by the Victorians and also built in the early 20th century. There were people displaced by them. There were complaints about them then. But those dams were built, and they now give millions of people and have for generations given people much higher standards of living. So in a way, some dams, a small number of them, definitely don't want to be built because they are just stupid. But we need to be looking at which dams should be built and trying to have public debates and then moving on to deciding when we can actually get large amounts of benefits and how we can ensure that anybody who is in a way losing out because of those dams, how they can be compensated so they're not treated unfairly. So I think in a way with the media, if we could eventually get to it looking at how do we build the right dams, that's the question we should be looking at, not just no dams.
Well, David, thank you. And I asked you that question as a member of the media. I did ask you, how does one build better dams? And it turns out you have a robust research around that very question. So thank you.
Okay, well, we were lucky on that one.
All right. All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to David. And I'm excited for what this new content partnership with the University of Manchester's Global Development Institute will bring. I think we're off to a good start. All right, well, see you next time. Bye.